Yeah, so I think what you'll notice is that the acknowledgement of country, it's written in what I would call the counter-narrative. I think that Nyungar is certainly, like I think other Aboriginal and Islander people in Australia, as well as the Māori and Toroa, there's this idea that we've been completely overrun and colonised and we've lost all our language and we don't know what's going on, we're in a complete tizzy, which I think is kind of nonsense. I think that our people are better than that and have been much stronger because on the one hand, when the colonisers came to colonise, certainly I think the Nyungars, like others, were in a counter-colonial process. People come to our budjera, to our lands, you come to my country, you're going to learn what I've got to say to you. And so I've got, this idea that we speak English, I would challenge that. I think that we don't actually, we speak a kind of English. We speak a hybrid English because the traditional owners and the old bosses of country spoke our language and we imposed it upon the outsiders. And the outsiders needed us to be able to interpret the landscape, to map out where they were going on the budjera, to make knowledge of science and understanding of the country. And it was the people of the Murut that gave them this knowledge. And of course, I hear people talking about the idea that we speak English, but I'm saying no. I think we actually speak. Certainly, where I come from, we speak Southwest Australian. Southwest Australian is different to Eastern Australian. It's different to Northern Australian, and it's different to Central Australian. But the guts of it is that all those people in those regional areas have manipulated and colonised the outsiders into our way of speaking. And how do I know that? Because, I've been to the US, I've been to Europe, I've been to England, and guess what? Those people over there can hardly understand what we're saying, even though we think we're speaking Queen's English. So this is my my homelands. And what you'll notice in my PowerPoint is I write in the classic Southwest Australian. It's not English, nor is it Noongar. It's a hybrid between the two. And if you come and live in our country, and I know when I travel around the traps, I see all this power there. But I think we tend to talk about it in a deficit way, but in actual fact, that's not a deficit. As I think Vicky alluded to, certainly in my part of the world, and I think everywhere in Australia, the Murut, the families, and the cutting and the science of the budja, the land. Certainly in the southwest of Australia, there's over 5,000 place names of Noongar origins, and people tell me they don't speak Nyungar. You can't operate, you can't move in my country without speaking in our language because you've got to talk about the place name, Mandurah, Mandogalup, Yallingup, and Joondalup or whatever. I'm being a person that works in unis, of course, when I was a young bloke, I used to listen to these expert scholars talking about theory and praxis and this and that discourse and dialogue and blah, blah, blah. And of course, there was this question about whether you would become a theoretician or a practical scholar. So somewhere between a theoretician and applied praxis was the question. And I, as a young bloke, I kind of thought, gee, wouldn't it be lovely? Wouldn't it be really good if you were a theorist? Does anyone try to be a theorist? There's a whole bunch of claptrap. But once you work it out, then you realise, oh yeah, it does actually make sense. So what I did as a young guy, my old people always told me, Lenny, later on when you become a man and you get around the traps, you've got to speak in our language because that's a sign that we still hold and carry the power through the governance and the authority of our tongue. And as we know, speaking language is a very powerful thing. So as you'll notice in the text there, the theoretical paradigm was based upon the Mut, the Kadija and the Budja, which is a trilogy that says family, country and science. And science it only means knowledge, but we seem to get intimidated when we hear scientists talking about things as if it's some complex thing. It's actually not. It's a pretty simple thing, science. So what I've written here is some sort of philosophical principles, the past, present and future, land, knowledge and family. And so the idea is the Kadich and the Wanga and the Mama is equivalent to research, community engagement and action go hand in hand as a part of governance. When us Noongars talk on our country, even when the Queen come to our country, we're the first people to stand up and talk. The Queen doesn't talk before us. The Governor doesn't talk before us. Nobody speaks before us when we're talking on our country. And that doesn't come around by a treaty. It's about Noongars imposing ourselves and telling people this is our country, don't disrespect us. And of course, internationally, nationally and locally, people understand that kind of politic. So the Kanya is about what it is, it's about respect. The idea of ngalakuling, of us walking and going together, going in hand, you know, white people, black ones, brown ones, good-looking ones and even ugly ones, we're all on the same trail. And don't ask me what the ugly ones and good-looking ones are, because I've probably been called both at different times. And while building a quap weir and calling the good spirit, you know, have you ever tried to work in a space where you're calling the bad spirit? You know, I think you know what that's all about. So the quap weir, ya calling nitya baranging ngan mark, ngalakuling while building ngan kadijin dallinging. So the thing about it is, what it all boils down to in our language, the Bidi. The Bidia is the leadership of governance, and the Bidi in our country, when you move in and on and around our country, you travel on the Bidi. The Bidi was the ancient tracks and trails that our people laid down a long time ago. I happen to know that it's everywhere, right across Australia and New Zealand and elsewhere. And of course, when the Europeans, when the British and the colonisers came, they said they discovered Australia. That's the biggest pack of crap I've ever heard in my life. Because you know what they did? They just come and saw the British and they said, can you show me where your tracks are? And they just walked along the tracks, were already laid there, just like a cattle path or a pathway on the grass when you were a kid walking to school. That's the pathway. They were always there. And today the highways and byways of the big roadways are built upon those ancient tracks and trails. I'm not going to read this thing out, but as you can see, the principles and the theory of the praxis is based upon these principles, Winjanunakuling, Nietzsche heritage. You know, so where are we going with all this language and why are we doing it? You know, the sense of place, I've already talked a bit about Budja. I mean, I'm just talking about South West Australia, but I imagine across Australia, the ancient Aboriginal place names are all there, and I challenge the fact that people are losing language. In Victoria, when I came here and I get off the plane and I get in my motor car and we go down to Bells Beach to see the Kuris and the Murrays and the Nungas, and we're all out there at the Indigenous Surfing Championships competing. There's all these signs that are on the side of the road that I see, and I have to ask some of the folk down there, what do these things mean? And of course, the irony of it is that even though they speak it every day, they don't necessarily know what the place names mean. And so, to me, that's a challenge for each and every one of you. It doesn't care whether you're an academic, whether you're a community engaged person, whether you're language bods, or just people that live in the families at home. Find out about what that road sign says on your road, or on your suburb, or on your mountain, because it's telling you a story. Crack the codes of the ancient place names, and that's one step that Aboriginal Australia and Māori New Zealand says that this is the mainstream. Don't get sucked into the colonial discourse about what it is. So heritage, the Budja, the Murish Budi, I think I mentioned about the strong path makers. The Kurayiyo Budi, the connection between the past, the present and the future, that's an unbroken fact. The Wangani, the speaking, the dialogue, the discourse, it operates not only in place names, but it operates in plants and birds and animals in this country. And I think when people start to relook and put a different set of lenses on, all of a sudden we're not talking about deficit models, we're not being apologetic, we're standing like Murich, Nyungas, proud and powerful people talking about and owning the powerful contributions that our people have made through language governance to shape and make the country with the outsiders coming in. Because yes, there is a lot of bullawam, there's a lot of strangeness amongst each other. And of course, people from the east to the north, the south and the west, we all sort of speak differently. But I think that even in that so-called difference, there's commonalities. And I know that when I go and hear other Aboriginal people speaking, that there's the little ancient words, the Jan, the Jenna, the Mara, the Mulya, the Meow, the Da. They actually are in a lot of the languages in Australia. So once upon a time, I can only theorise and summarise that there must have been a linguistic frunca amongst the Aborigines of this nation. And so I think it's still there. So what are some of the challenges for doing all this sort of work? Building the skills and the capacity, the decreasing resources. I mean, the government either puts it in or takes out the drop of hat, so you don't know whether you're coming or going. There's no surety about this. drawing in, one of the challenges, drawing in community, government, business and associated interests, building the relationships within Noongar, internal as well as external. And when I use the word Noongar, I mean I can apply it to Kuri or Murri or Nunga or whatever, because the principles that I'm talking about are principles that apply to everybody. So, I just happen to be obviously speaking in the context of the Southwest Noongar dialogue. Local, national, international language and governance contexts, I think, is a challenge. But the thing about it is, of course, understanding the cultural languages and the government policies, geopolitics, and things like Noongarpedia, academy and community. So the principles around these past, present and future, speaking and differences. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Well, I covered that. But anyway, because we've only got 10 minutes, as you can tell, folk, I try to stick to the timeline. So I mentioned the Noongarpedia. It's the only Aboriginal pedia in Australia. The Noongars are out there onto that one. If you want to look at how do we develop intergenerational and time zones, the Noongarpedia, I think the Maoris have got a fantastic pedia. They're right out there, probably in front of pretty well everybody. But certainly within the Australian context, a Noongarpedia is a knowledge-building capacity. You don't have to be a Noongar, you can be anybody to come in and join on the Noongarpedia. You can learn and contribute at the same time. And I'll put the challenge out to there. Who's from the Kuri peoples? Put your hand up. All right, Kuris, I think you better pull your socks up and get yourself a Kuripedia. Who's amongst the Murris here? All right, you Murris, I think you better pull your socks up. Where's the Nungas? Yeah, I think you too. So I'm not going to discriminate, and I'm going to put it out there to say that next time I come back to Victoria, what I want to see is a plethora of these technologies, teaching and learning to be a contributor and a learner. That's the way we're going to do it. And guess what, folks? The government can't control the media, and it can't control the pedia. So that's the liberating, that's the self-determination practice. Another one there is the Quap Mum and the good men. Aboriginal men today, we're getting flogged from one side of the nation to the other. I suspect in New Zealand it's pretty well the same. And I know globally men are portrayed as X. The fact of the matter is those men deserve to be held to account. But if the good men don't stand up and talk about the good things that men do in community and culture and language, only the bad will overcome us. So if you want to look at the Quap Marmon, it's another one. It's got a heap of language stuff around principles and practices about KPIs for good men. The Budjerang Noongar place names, it's the Southwest studies of the place names of Southwest Australia. And the Wardang Cuddy is another example. But the thing about it is, going back to the Budja place names one, talking about governance and language and determination and whatnot, the thing about it is that, as I mentioned, right across Australia, I think I would say there must be tens of thousands of Aboriginal and Islander place names, and I think New Zealand would be the same, on the maps right across the landscapes of the two nations. And one of the ironies of it is, folk, again, I'll put the challenge out to you. When you go home tomorrow and you see a signpost, I want you to write it down and then I want you to say what it is and post it on social media. Do you reckon you can do that? But you know what the challenge is? I think people would struggle to understand what the signpost means. But of course there would be people that do know what it means. And this is the challenge. We live in our homelands. We drive down the highways and byways and the biddy of our nation and we can't even make sense of a sign. Now what if the sign, for example, said, Waramui da Nyunga Nyining? Imagine if that was a sign and you lived there. Put your hand up and say, how would I know what that meant? Well, if you lived there, you know what it means? Only ugly people live here. And who'd want to live in the ugly land? Oh, my children live in ugly land. Oh, you must be the ugly people. Oh, okay. So the irony of it is that, and I'll use that as a joke, as you can tell, but that if we really want to know and understand the tracks and trails of the ancients, locating language embedded in the landscape, we must understand what it actually means to live in a suburb or a town, with an Aboriginal place name. Back at home, you can look on the Southwest Land and Sea Council website and the Noongar language websites. So there's a couple of sites there for hopefully for future that might inspire you to have a look-see. Now, sorry, going the wrong way. The last thing about it is that Ngarungunding, when the sun goes down, we shall remember Yunga kariri nita yunga buja governance. Kaya. To wrap it up, can anyone tell me what the Noongars say when they say, see you later on? See you later on. Or of course, as Budawan Ngan Jenangin Nuna. Thank you.